So if Russia knows that all of those are still vulnerable, it will force Russia into an even more complex situation where they have to pull all their leadership and all their logistics and all their ammunition even further back from the front line.
Let's speak to William Alberque now, the Director of Strategy, Technology and Arms Control at the International Institute for Strategic Studies. Thanks for being with us, William. No big announcement today. Intense lobbying, though, from Ukraine to try and get both the UK and US to back use of Western weapons to attack inside Russian territory. If that announcement was to be made, how big is the significance from your point of view?
Oh, I mean, it's huge. When you talk about the UK systems and the US systems that have been supplied that can reach deeper inside Russia, you're talking about the Storm Shadow air launched cruise missile, a very fine UK system, and the ATACMS ground launched artillery of the United States design, 190-mile range. This would allow Ukraine to destroy critical Russian leadership and logistics and ammunition and supply hubs that they have pulled out from the front lines deeper away from Ukrainian lines in order to protect them. So if Russia knows that all of those are still vulnerable, it will force Russia into an even more complex situation where they have to pull all their leadership and all their logistics and all their ammunition even further back from the front line.
What do you think is preventing the US, it seems, more from the US side, this delay on making an announcement on it? What do you think is causing that delay? Where is the concern here?
Within the United States government, there's a couple people who are incredibly concerned about escalation, that the U.S. would allow Ukraine to do something, and that would force or that would cause Russia to escalate in their war. But time and time again, those fears have been overcome. For instance, supplying mobile artillery or supplying battle tanks or supplying F-16s. At every stage we think that Russia might escalate, it hasn't happened. Um, I think Blinken has very publicly put himself in this position because I think he wants to supply these weapons to Ukraine. But there's still some people around Biden who don't want this to happen. Again, every time we've crossed Russia's red lines, it has worked out in Ukraine's favor. And I think Ukraine's incursion into Russia itself was to try to demonstrate to the United States that Russia's talk of red lines and escalation is really nonsense. It's about the grinding war that's going on and Ukraine's ability to strike deep inside of Russia to change Russia's military calculus. That really is very important here. So I think this Friday meeting will be an opportunity for Biden to change his mind.
Look, David Lammy, our Foreign Secretary, said that Iran's delivery of missiles to Russia has already escalated this war. He urged China not to get involved, not to do the same, not to supply further weaponry to Vladimir Putin. Just a quick word on that US debate last night, if I can, William, between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump. And I wonder what, for example, Joe Biden, Antony Blinken, David Lammy, Keir Starmer thought about Donald Trump dodging the question on whether he wanted Ukraine to win the war. He wanted the war to be over, but he was very careful about saying that Ukraine should win the war.
I mean, as an American, I find that very disheartening. I think Trump should support a Ukrainian victory. And the way that Trump said that, it was very clear he's sending a signal to Putin that he would lobby for Putin's interests in terms of ending the war on Russia's terms, which I think is a horrible sign for someone who wants that office to send. We should be supporting Ukraine 100%.
Look, thanks for being with us. William Alberque, who is a Director of Strategy, Technology and Arms Control at the International Institute for Strategic Studies. Good to have your time. Thank you.
Thank you.
The Foreign Secretary, David Lammy, has announced £600 million worth of support for Ukraine. Now, he's accompanied by the US Secretary of State, his opposite number, Antony Blinken, for talks in Kyiv today. It's thought the US may allow Ukraine to fire Western-made missiles into Russian territory at Russian targets, well, maybe within weeks. Let's get the thoughts of Sir Mark Lyle-Grant, who is a former national security advisor. Good afternoon to you, Sir Mark.
Good afternoon, John.
Hi, welcome. It does feel, doesn't it, Mark, as if we're heading for a yes on the use of longer-range missiles into Russian territory?
Yes, that is being foreshadowed in these various talks. I mean, slightly bizarrely being sort of discussed in public in a way. But I think the Americans are edging towards relaxing one of these further restrictions that they've been putting on Ukraine over the last 2.5 years.
Yeah, and the inhibition about that until now and until this is announced, assuming it will be announced, is pretty much solely about the fear of escalation on the Russian side. Is that fair?
Yes, and it's not the first time. If you recall, at the beginning of this conflict, President Biden was very clear they weren't going to be selling or gifting to the Ukrainians offensive weapons. They weren't going to be giving some of the most recent missiles. They weren't going to be giving F-16s. And slowly, these restrictions have been lifted as the war goes on, and it's become a sort of 2.5-year war of attrition, because Zelensky has always argued that he's fighting with one hand behind his back. Now, this final restriction, which is on the use of sophisticated Western missiles to fire into Russia, is another threshold that could be passed.
Yeah.
And of course, the reason that they've been cautious about it is the risk of escalation.
Yes.
But of course, there's always been a risk of Russian escalation. And I think the time has certainly come to allow Zelensky to prosecute this war in a more aggressive way in order to protect his people.
Well, and given what the hesitation, especially on the American side, and President Biden is said to have been particularly hesitant about all of this, can we assume there'll be conditions, or there would be conditions, attached to the use of these long-range missiles? There have been, well, quite a lot of drone strikes by Ukraine deep into Russia, into Moscow itself. There's no way we're going to be seeing British long-range missiles landing in Moscow, is there?
No, because the weapons we're talking about, the weapon systems are the American ATACMs, ATACMs, they have a range of about 190 miles.
Yeah.
The Storm Shadow missile, cruise missile that the British have given to Ukraine is only about 150 miles. So what we're talking about is very precision-guided missiles, which would target airfields relatively close to the Ukrainian border, from which these glide bombs and others are launched, attacking missile launching stations, supply depots, ammunition dumps, etc. So this is not taking the war to Moscow, no. I'm sure the Ukrainians will continue to send drones further afield when they can, but these are Ukrainian-made drones, not Western ones. So these systems, these modern Western systems, are very precise and will be targeted at military targets. And I'm sure one of the conditions that will be set is that there shouldn't be civilian collateral damage. And there's no reason why there should be, given the precision nature of these weapons.
Right, so do you judge, and I know it's a difficult judgment, but do you judge that the use of these long-range missiles could turn out to be a bit of a game changer in the war? Because for all of Ukraine's dramatic incursions into the Russian territory at Kursk, it does seem that the Russians still pretty much have the upper hand when it comes to the front line of fighting.
I'd be hesitant to use the word game changer, John, because as you say, the Russians are making very slow, but nonetheless some progress in the eastern Donbass. And they haven't been diverted from the incursion into Kursk, into Russian territory by some of the more elite Ukrainian forces. So I don't think this would necessarily change the dynamic of the war, but I think it puts Ukraine in a better position if and when there are some negotiations to end the conflict. And with the American elections coming, with still the possibility that President Trump will come back, Zelensky must have in the back of his mind the fact that he needs to make some gains, some real advantage on the battlefield to prepare for the eventual negotiating phase.
All right, we're going to be keeping a close eye on that joint visit by the Foreign Secretary and the Secretary of State into Kyiv. Anything that you need to know on that, promise you we'll bring that to you as soon as it happens. Meanwhile, Sir Lyle Grant, former National Security Advisor, thank you so much for joining us.